Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there, and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo.
Amateur Traveler, episode 664. Today, the Amateur Traveler talks about castles and cathedrals and canals, Christmas markets and locks as we sail the Danube, Main, and Rhine River from Budapest to Amsterdam. Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Let's talk about a Danube River cruise. I'd like to welcome back to the show Mark Baker, travel writer and guidebook author, who's come today to talk to us about a cruise that may be on your bucket list, which is a cruise on the Danube. Mark, welcome back to the show.
Hey, thank you, Chris.
Mark, I see as a guidebook author, just recently the author of the Slovenia Lonely Planet Guide, I think is the most recent one that you have published, but he's been on the show previously talking about a cruise on the Volga River, or at least a trip down the Volga River. And so it's good. You seem to be river-based here recently, Mark.
I'm your waterman. Yeah,
it's good to have a specialty. I always appreciate that. Well, and I feel like this may be a silly question, but why aren't we talking about the Danube?
We're talking about the Danube and the Main and the Rhine Rivers. What I've been doing are these combination cruises from Budapest up to Amsterdam. So most of the cruise takes place on the Danube between, say, Budapest and Regensburg or Passau, Germany. And then at some point, then we hop onto another river, the Main River in Germany. And then we ride it across southern Germany towards getting closer to France. We take a right on the Rhine River and then all the way up to Amsterdam. It takes about 15 days.
And why are we talking about this?
Probably the first reason is that these cruises have become really, really popular. The European river cruise industry has boomed in the past few years, although there are several different rivers that you can try in Europe, including several rivers in France and other places. But it seems like most people seem to opt for this kind of through the heart of Europe. I wouldn't say basic cruise, but I mean like kind of a good introductory to Europe cruise.
Yeah, I would say either this one or the shorter Rhine River cruise that goes more from, say, Basel up to Amsterdam, which I've done, takes about a week, are the two that I think are the most popular as far as I can tell.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really popular one and a very beautiful cruise.
Well, and we have talked about that one before on the show. And so one of the reasons I do want to start this in the order that you said from Budapest up is that we have less coverage on that Danube part and the Mainz River. No,
The Rhine River. Yeah, you're right. Mainz is a city on the Rhine River. Yeah.
excellent.
Well, you know the city Frankfurt am Main? That's Frankfurt on the Rhine River, basically. That's
I
what that
did
means.
know that. Okay, I should know that better than that. Okay, so when you say mine, we're spelling that Main then.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
That was what was throwing me. Okay, excellent. So we're going to start in Budapest, which we've talked about a little on the show. In fact, we took a group of listeners to Budapest 2 years ago now. Are there things that we want to do in Budapest before we get on the boat?
The river cruising has a lot of advantages. Say you don't have to get off the boat and repack and pack your things. You don't have to find dinner reservations every night, etc. But one disadvantage, I would say, is that you never actually spend that much time in any individual city.
Sure.
So some of the guests have said to me that they wish that they could spend more time in Budapest because it's such a big city. It's got all kinds of things to see and do. And with the river cruise, we only really spend a day and a half there, and that's not enough time to see everything there. So probably what you want to do is to fly into Budapest a day or two before the cruise, get acclimated to the time zone, and then maybe take a day or 2 days to see some of the things that you really want to see in Budapest that might not be on the cruise excursion.
Well, and with cruises in general, I usually recommend you get in a day early, although river cruises are a little less problematic in the sense that if you miss a cruise in the Caribbean, for instance, you're going to have to fly to the next spot. If you mix a European river cruise, you get on a train and you go meet the boat. I mean, it's not as bad.
You can practically take an Uber from Budapest to the next
Sometimes.
stop.
I think Budapest it stops in Vienna next is what I'm seeing for some of them. So it depends on which boat you're on. And excellent. So back to the question, anything we want to do in Budapest before we get on the boat? Or in that we're not going to cover? It's going to depend on our itinerary. Also, different cruise lines are going to have different itineraries. You've been working with an Australian cruise line, Scenic Cruise, is my understanding.
You're right. That's correct. What I do, I work for National Geographic Expeditions on these cruises.
Mm-hmm.
And National Geographic Expeditions has partnered with Scenic to offer, I don't know how many cruises during the summer, maybe 10 or 12 different cruises. And that would take a normal Scenic river cruise and then add a National Geographic dimension to it.
Mm-hmm.
By that, I mean that you would get me on the boat. I would be holding lectures and presentations in the evening about European history or about some of the things that we're going to be seeing in the next couple of days, or even lectures on contemporary issues in politics and whatever's going on in the European Union. And then with that National Geographic edition, you would also get a National Geographic photographer on board, and his or her job would be to talk about photography from a professional photographer standpoint, but also, of course, to help you to improve your own photography. So things National Geographic actually adds a couple of its own excursions at some of the destinations. So you would get all of the scenic stuff plus a kind of overlay of National Geographic stuff.
Well, and looking for those sort of theme cruises like the Nat Geo cruise, I think are a good option for people because if you're a wine lover, you might do the same cruise as a wine cruise with a local vineyard, or you can even find other theme cruises that are more strange, like particular bands and things like that, less so on the river. But there are different things like that, and that will often add to the cost of the cruise a little, but it will also add to the value that you get out of it.
It does add a bit to the cost, I believe, depending on what you're into for a cruise.
Yeah.
Many people just want to go have a good time on the river. I mean, we do have a good time, don't get me wrong, but they're not really that interested in history, architecture, contemporary issues, whatever.
Sure.
They just want to go to Germany or have some wine or listen to some music. And that's great too, but we try to offer a different dimension.
Well, and when we talk about different countries, the route we're talking about here would cover Hungary, obviously, Austria, Germany, Netherlands. Quite often, some boats will also do an excursion into the Czech Republic, and then I'm missing one. Oh, Slovakia. Also, you're going along the border between Slovakia and Hungary. Much of that is that Danube River.
Yes, exactly. We also flowed into Slovakia. I mean, the Danube does go through Slovakia. So we go Hungary, Slovakia, and then Vienna. And then one of the excursions in Vienna that the guests have the option of taking is actually once we get to Vienna, they can get off the boat and get onto a bus and go back to Bratislava and spend a few hours walking around Bratislava if they want to see that in Slovakia.
Okay. Excellent. That would be a great option if you've been to Vienna before, but you haven't been to Bratislava, for instance.
Exactly.
And I'm assuming that the cruise line you're doing is like a lot of the other major river cruise lines that tend to have at least one included excursion at each stop?
We normally have 3 or 4 excursions, and some of those are the National Geographic additional ones.
Yep.
So probably Scenic would offer 2, at least 2 at each location, and then a third, and then sometimes you might even get a Nat Geo additional one. So that would give guests the option of 4 different choices.
But would some of those be additional prices?
With our cruises, at least, and in some of the other cruise companies, a lot of those are already built into the price.
Okay.
I mean, some of them you have to opt each day and say, well, I'll do that one at this additional price. But with Scenic, which I think is a pretty good thing, is you basically buy the whole package. So at least one excursion each day is included in the price of your cruise.
Well, and that's something that when you're comparing the price of a river cruise, that's something to keep in mind too, because I know if I'm off on a big ocean going ship, that a lot of those, depending on the class that I'm in, if I'm in a luxury class, I'm going to see more included options. But if I'm not, if I'm on a Carnival or a Holland America or something like that, I usually tell people to factor in, take the price of your cruise times 1.5. So, another 50% for the excursions. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean that you don't want to get so cheap that you don't do excursions. And since they're not factored in, it's going to be something you need to factor into the cost. With the river cruise, you're going to start a little higher price point for a lot of it, unless you're comparing, again, to the luxury cruises. But you do have more of this that's included in that you're not going to pay for. And then often if you're on a Viking or I suspect a Scenic or one of these cruise lines that's on these things, often you're also not paying for every drink that you have at dinner, which is another cost that you need to factor in and think about that as you're comparing the prices of various vacation options.
With the cruises that I've been working on with Scenic, everything is included in the price, the food, the drinks, and the excursion.
And that's much more typical at the river cruise level. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a great way to go, at least for river cruising, because you aren't always thinking, should I have this drink or should I have this food or should I go on this excursion? You've basically already paid for it. So there's no reason not to go or to have that drink.
Exactly. The only thing that's usually not included is the crew gratuity. And so you'd want to factor that into your budgeting too. And we have an article on Amateur Traveler about preparing for your first cruise if you have questions about this. Excellent. But let's get back to the destinations. Anything we want to say about Budapest before we move down the river or up the river, I guess, in this case?
At least for our excursions, we do a city sightseeing tour on a bus and we have a hiking tour up to Buda Castle.
Yep.
But what we don't include, at least in Scenic, getting off the bus, I mean, you see everything from the bus, but go to the Great Synagogue, take the tour of the Opera House, or take the tour of the Parliament building, or take the tour of the House of Terror. What you want to do is to read the fine print very carefully on your cruise itinerary and to make sure that you actually get to the places that you want to go to and don't expect the cruise to always deliver you to the places that you want to see, because sometimes they just won't.
Especially if you're doing a bus tour, that's going to be a very different experience than if you go to the Széchenyi Baths or you do have that Parliament tour, which you're going to need to book ahead of time. They have limited tours, especially in English. As we talked about in the recent show that we did on Prague, Krakow, and Budapest, book that early and ahead of time. Excellent. And then we're going up the river. Is your next stop Vienna, or you have that backtrack to Bratislava, as you said?
Yeah, but we don't actually stop. Our boat doesn't stop. Probably some boats do stop. And there are some really pretty little towns north of Budapest, which we don't stop at, but you can see from the riverfront. Our next stop, and it's a very long cruise that day, is from Budapest to Vienna.
You just got off the plane, so you get to sleep in that day.
We really sail practically the entire next day because for whatever reason, you go through some locks and it's not as quick as you'd think. The two cities are not actually that close together from the river perspective. So it takes the better part of a good day to sail between those two cities, and you can actually relax on that day. Yes.
Excellent. And do we want to say anything specific about Vienna while we're there?
You reminded me of something that's a really great tip for people who are booking a cruise. If you really want to see some of these really very popular attractions, like you mentioned, the Opera House or the Parliament building in Budapest, in Vienna, of course, you have all kinds of very popular things, like the Spanish Riding School or taking specific tours of the Hofburg or some other thing that you might want to do in Vienna, concert, exactly, opera performance. It's really your responsibility to get out on the web, to find performances that you might want to see and to book those tickets. You can't really expect the staff on the boat to do that, although they'll help you, but you're there on that same day and it's very limited what they can do to help you. And then, of course, just jumping way ahead to Amsterdam, the very same issue pops up there. If you want to go to Anne Frank, you better book those tickets months and months in advance. So when you buy the cruise ticket, look at the itinerary very carefully, do some research, find a few places that you want to add to the tour's itinerary, and then get out on the web and buy those tickets. That's really the best advice I think I can give you.
And are there particular things that you would recommend that typically are not included in Vienna that you ought to look for ahead of time?
We do the Schönbrunn Palace, which was the summer home of the Habsburg family. There's also that excursion to Bratislava, of course. National Geographic has a fantastic mini excursion to the Museum of Natural History, where we talk to the curator for their extensive meteorite collection there. It's very, very interesting. Sometimes people go to the Belvedere Palace, which is a Baroque palace, very a famous one, very interesting as well. But we didn't do the Spanish Riding School, and we didn't do a night at the opera. We did have a musical performance in Vienna, but it wasn't that. So what you really need to do is, like I said, you have to supplement your cruise itinerary a little bit on your own.
Excellent. And like Budapest, we have a show just on Vienna as well, if you want to use that for your research. Excellent. Are we back up the river again then?
Yes, we're on. Exactly.
Now we're in the area that we haven't covered on Amateur Traveler. We're finally that part of the Danube that if you're going to see it, you're probably going to see it on a river cruise.
The Danube in Austria becomes very, very beautiful. Cuts through gorges and valleys and little towns on the river. Our cruise and a lot of the other cruises, we stop at two places in central Austria along the Danube, and they're both small, picturesque towns. One is really a village called Dürnstein, has the big castle on the top. And then the next one is about 30 kilometers away or so, and it's called Melk, and it's the home of a very famous Baroque abbey monastery. And probably most cruises will stop in one or the other of those two places, and our cruise actually stops in both of those places.
Excellent. Anything else we want to know about those spots? You mentioned the Abbey.
When I said we had 2 or 3 or even 4 sometimes excursions, a lot of times the excursions are broken out into what people might want to do, different groups of what people might want to do. Like there might be one set of excursions that are aimed at very active people. So there'll be a hike or a bike ride. People who are interested less in history, but more in food and wine. So there might be a wine or food tasting.
Right.
And then there might be a basic city tour. And then there might be a specialized museum visit or something like that. So that's basically the group, the categories of excursions. But between Dürnstein and Melk is a very beautiful bicycling trail. And what we did was we put in at Dürnstein, we got on our bikes and we pedaled the 35 kilometers, about 20 miles or so, up to Melk, and then picked up the boat again in Melk and then hopped back on and got on for the ride. So river cruising, although you don't get a lot of physical exercise, you can structure the excursions that you do get a little bit of exercise, at least on that particular day. We got quite a lot of exercise.
No, that's interesting because in my experience, especially on the Rhine River cruise, and I think I was on Avalon or Alma, tended to be an older clientele. So it's interesting that they're adding in more of the active adventures because that's going to draw younger people and families more.
When you say families, I don't think river cruising is It's not family friendly, but it's really more oriented toward couples actually than couples with children, I would say. But yeah, you're totally right about the age. It used to be not too long ago that most river cruisers were, say, 60 plus. And I would say that that's still the case, but there are many passengers in their 50s and 40s and occasionally even younger couples. So the demographic for river cruises is changing a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this National Geographic thing adds a layer that appeals to people who are more active generally. That could very well be the case.
Well, I've certainly seen other companies that are trying to draw even in the millennial crowd and the Gen Xers, and I'm just curious to see if that's going to happen. I mean, the price points we're talking about for some of these, the Danube one, for instance, you can break that up and not do the whole 2 weeks. You could just do the half week to Nuremberg, and it's not bad. I mean, we're talking about right now, I could book that cruise for a little over $2,000, and I was expecting that to be more expensive as we were talking about these. And you factor in that I could do that in December and do it with the Christmas markets, which is the last time I was scheduled to do the Danube cruise, but I unfortunately, I got invited to the White House.
Oh,
there's a sentence you don't usually get to use, but I had to cancel that. But that makes that an attractive itinerary at not a bad price point, really, compared to just when you think about booking 8 nights of hotels and things like that.
I think the scenic cruises are a little more expensive than that, even week-long cruise. But like I said, it includes a lot of things.
I was actually looking at the scenic cruise page as I said that.
Oh, is that right?
Just so you know.
Okay, wow.
I wasn't necessarily looking at the
excellent.
Nat Geo option, but
That's a terrific price. I don't know if you could do it at that price point. Sometimes you can even get the cruise company to pick up your airfare and throw in all kinds of other transportation.
yeah, probably not at this price point because this one is on sale. So
Yes. Okay.
this is already down for 50% off or something like that. So
Yeah.
and cruises will go on sale. So that is something you want to look for if you're interested in itinerary, as look for last minute or look for sales or get on somebody's newsletter because they want to fill that boat. That boat's going to go anyway. And so there are sale opportunities available, especially if you have some flexibility.
Yeah, that's
Cool.
absolutely right.
Shall we move up the river a little more?
Okay, next stop after this is Salzburg. Actually, the river, the Danube, doesn't actually get that close to Salzburg, so you have to put in at a very small port on the river and then get on a bus and go over. The Salzburg is a day trip. It's treated as I wouldn't say mandatory excursion, but I mean like almost the whole boat goes to this city on that day.
Yeah.
And it's built around Sound of Music and Mozart. And Salzburg is interesting, even if you're not interested in the sound of music or in Mozart. It's a beautiful city. It's got a lot of great architecture, and it's a nice little ramble around the place. Of course, if you are interested in the movie or if you are interested in Mozart, then it'll have special significance for you. It'll be one of the highlights of your trip for sure.
Excellent. And a beautiful city as well.
Yes, absolutely.
And that one we do have an amateur traveler episode about.
Oh, you do?
Of course. We've been doing
great.
this. We're coming
Excellent.
up
Of course you do.
We're coming up on 14 years here. There's a few episodes.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. Me personally, not a fan of the Sound of Music. Not fan, but it's not anything that I really spend a lot of time thinking about or rewatching. But very much in the minority on these river cruises. People can sing Edelweiss and all the songs from that movie. And there are some really fun excursions that are built around the movie. Like we go up into a lodge in the hills near where some of the scenes were filmed. And we get a little bit of a song and dance routine from some Austrian kids. It's very nice.
I think I could probably do all the songs by heart. So
Okay.
Let's fess up here.
By now I can too. That's for sure.
Excellent.
From Salzburg, we're still on the Danube, and the river turns towards the north and the west, and we start entering into Germany at this point. But this is an area of the river that is not particularly well developed in terms of river transportation technology. I'm talking about locks and other types of mechanical things that make the river passable in all types of weather. So if you have low water or high water, especially low water, especially high water, this little piece of the Danube, say between Salzburg and Regensburg, going through Passau, or say Passau and Regensburg, this is a place where your boat might be caught out a little bit. It's happened occasionally.
Well, and I know one of the things that they will do at that point, talked to somebody who did a river cruise recently, and they were doing this same thing on the Rhine, where because of low water, they couldn't get through the Rhine River gorge. And the company they were on, I believe it was Viking in this case, just met them with a sister ship, and they got on a smaller boat to bridge the gap, and all of their luggage was transferred, and you have the same cabin, same cabin number. It's just a completely different boat.
On a relatively small percentage of river cruises, but it's significant. So it's something that you always have to watch out for when you book a river cruise, is that there will be some summers or some seasons where the water is low and some when the water is high. And of course, for river cruises, both of these can pose big problems. I mean, too low and you're scraping the bottom, too high and the bridge and the top of the boats are hitting the bottom of the bridges. So there's a window where the river is just right. And most of the time you get through just fine. But you always have to prepare for potentially swapping ships, usually doing a bus transfer. I've never heard of a boat transfer, but that would be maybe a better way to do it.
Well, they were at the Rhine River Gorge, which you wanted to see, and you wanted to see from the water. And so that's why they did the boat transfer there, right?
Yeah, of course. My first river cruise last summer, we ran into low water and we had to take a bus between Salzburg and Regensburg, actually.
Oh, wow.
Then we got off our first boat and then we got onto a different boat in Regensburg.
The logistics involved for the cruise company are something that I respect. Being able to do that in a fashion that people's stuff are in the right place, that everybody finds the right ship, is something that is tip your hat to.
I have to say that they have it down to a science. It's really well done. It's an inconvenience, but it's a relatively minor inconvenience, and it shouldn't be anything that's going to ruin a trip. That's for sure.
And my impression is that high water, you're more likely to get it early in the season with the snow melting, and that low water, you're more likely to get in a drought in the middle of the summer. Am I at all on base here?
In generally correct, but sometimes the weather is so unpredictable.
Sure.
This last cruise that I did, I just completed a cruise 2 weeks ago, and we started in Budapest in near flood stage. And there were rumors going around the boat that might have to swap boats around Regensburg, where we are in our discussion, because the water might be too high. But in the end, it worked out perfectly. We sailed all the way from Budapest to Amsterdam without any problems.
Excellent. Anything else we want to say about this section before we move a little further along?
The main highlights here are Regensburg, and then Nuremberg, and then Bamberg, and then Würzburg. I call them the Bergs. One means castles, one means hills. The cruise takes a very different turn from the Danube from here. The Danube is a lot about Vienna. It's about the Habsburgs. It's even about the East-West in the Cold War, because a lot of the Danube was a communist river until 1989. Mm-hmm. Once we get into Germany, it's more about beer and Bavaria, brats. It becomes much more about basic pleasures, not thinking about all the intellect stuff. And there's kind of a theme that runs through all these little towns in Germany. And that's it. Once you leave Regensburg, after a little bit, you kind of deviate and you get onto some canals that eventually take you to the Main River, which eventually takes you to the Rhine River. Mm-hmm. And there are so many locks on this river, dozens and dozens of locks. If you're really into locks, and I think most people take river cruises find that pretty interesting, first few locks are fascinating. The boat gets raised and lowered, sure. And I mean, it's an amazing spectacle. But once you've gone through 40 locks or 50 locks, something like that, it's a good time to spend some time in the lounge and relax when you're going through a lock, actually. So the progress you make through Germany in this second phase of the journey feels a lot slower. Mm-hmm. Moving on smaller water, you're stopping at smaller towns. The towns are closer together. Your concentration is, usually a beautiful city with a glass of beer and a bratwurst or something.
I could live with that. I'm not a beer fan, but I love the brat. So
Regensburg and Nuremberg both have a brat tradition. One says mine is better. The other says ours is better. You can sample on your own and see what kind of thing you like. It's pretty cool.
Well, and if you're doing that December Christmas market cruise, Nuremberg is going to be, I would think, a highlight too, because they have such a beautiful Christmas market there.
Absolutely true. Probably a Christmas markets cruise, you're going to start your journey in Nuremberg or end it in Nuremberg
Yep.
and either make your way to Budapest or come from Budapest. So
Mhm.
depending on your thing, you probably won't go too much further into Germany on that
Right.
Christmas markets cruise, depending, of course, on the trip you've booked.
Mhm. And a beautiful city also. One of the reasons why the Nuremberg trials after World War II were held in Nuremberg, it was one of the cities that was largely intact in Germany, where so many were destroyed by Allied bombing. And so it does have a beautiful old town in the city, and the clock there and all of that tradition there and the shops. I enjoyed Nuremberg. I think I've only been there one time, but quite enjoyed that city.
When I was working for the National Geographic expedition, I was a destination expert on board the ship. And part of my job was to give these presentations in the evening, usually in the evening, evening, say the late afternoon, or sometimes in the morning, depending on our sailing schedule.
Mm-hmm.
And I would try to structure the talks around things that were significant in Europe or things that I thought that the passengers could benefit from knowing about architecture or history, and then also sometimes about particular cities that we're going to be visiting. And when we got to Nuremberg, it was a great chance to talk about the Nuremberg laws that came before World War II, of course. Those were the laws that restricted the rights of Jewish citizens. Mm-hmm. And then Nuremberg during the war, and Nuremberg was actually pretty well destroyed during the war. And then the Nuremberg trials afterwards. So it's a very interesting city to talk about World War II around. And there's a lot of stuff still to see, including the Nazi Party rally grounds outside the city, and then the new documentation center that documents the crimes of the Nazi Party in the lead up to World War II and during the war. And it's fascinating.
And I'm looking at pictures of Nuremberg after the war and thinking I had the impression that it hadn't been damaged, but it's one of those that they rebuilt stone by stone, and it fooled me. They don't usually fool me that way, but you were right.
90% destroyed, Chris.
Wow. Oh, interesting.
Done a great job. It is a beautiful place. They've done a nice job in some places in rebuilding it, that's for sure.
I didn't realize how wrong I was there, but I appreciate the correction. Excellent. Anything else we want to talk about in the Berg?
Yeah, let's move on now towards the Rhine. How's that?
That's fine.
So the first time you get to the Rhine is in Rudesheim, which is a city that's a surprisingly charming place that not many visitors outside of Germany will have ever heard of. I never did. I'm living in Prague now for nearly 30 years, and I had never even heard the word Rudesheim. It's a very nice place. You spend a day there, like you go up in a gondola. You see the city from way above. There's one of those enormous monuments to the unification or the reunification of Germany in 1871, when the German principalities and city-states united as Germany, as the country we know as Germany today. And then from that monument, you can look down on the town and the Rhine, and it's very pretty. And then once you get on the boat and leave Rudesheim, you go into the Rhine Gorge or the Middle Rhine Valley, however you want to call it. That's that catalog, Chris. That's that river cruise catalog shot that you see of all those ruined hilltop castles on each side of the river. The Danube is a river for sure. I don't want to discount it in any way. But the Main is a very small river, relatively small river. And a lot of times you're on canals. So once you get out on the Rhine, you start to remember, wow, I'm really on a river cruise again, because the Rhine really feels like a river.
Mm. Well, and you say the castles along the side, also some of the castles, at least one very well-known one right in the middle of the Rhine, because these were collecting tolls. They were basically, this was the highway that your goods were going on, and if you wanted some of that money, you built your castle where you could take your cut.
This was the New Jersey Turnpike of Germany at that time, right?
I am not sure that they would appreciate that comparison, but
No. It's a beautiful stretch of river, and if you catch it and happen to catch it on a sunny afternoon, and the tour companies are really, the river cruise companies really know how to plan that trip. So you sail through there from 1 o'clock in the afternoon to say 5 o'clock in the afternoon. By the time you get to Koblenz, which would be kind of the end point of that very, very beautiful stretch. And so you have 2, 3, 4 hours up on deck. All you do is sit there, have your drinks, maybe take your camera out, snap a photo of a castle, a ruin on top of a hill, and then wait for the next ruin. And it's beautiful. It's really, really pretty.
We did that when I did the Rhine River cruise in the morning, actually first thing. So we had morning light, which was lovely for some of the photography, but it was also a October cruise. And
Okay.
the one thing I will say that's a disadvantage about those cruises later in the season is that time that you'd love to be spending up on deck is a little chillier.
I mean, I can imagine by October, it's probably getting dark by 6 o'clock at night.
Sure. Now you're still going to do it at daylight, but exactly. And the castle in the middle of the river that I was trying to remember the name of is the Pfalzgrafenstein Castle. And I'll have a picture of that at this point in the episode if you're listening to the iTunes enhanced version, and quite possibly it will be the iconic photo on the episode as it sits on amateurtraveler.com.
Super. As a destination expert, I'm presented as a regional expert, but I don't know all of those castles or even all of those cities that on our trip. It's more of a European or a regional expert.
Sure,
so
yeah.
For me, that's a long afternoon when passengers come up to me and tap me on the shoulder, point to a castle and say, now tell me the story of that castle. And I'm like, okay.
I would think you'd start making things up at that point.
I do. Absolutely. It helps to have a very active imagination when you try to tell some of these stories.
Throw in the cruel stepmother and it'll all work.
Oh yeah, there's always somebody trapped in a dungeon, always somebody who had a beautiful daughter was being auctioned off to the next sailor or something like that. I mean,
excellent. Well, in fact, the story Lorelei comes from this area.
Yes, exactly. Well, we on our boat we sail right through the Lorelei.
Right.
You know, it's a particularly treacherous stretch of the Rhine River, the site of many accidents. It has hidden rocks below the waterline that are not always easy to see, particularly in bad weather. And of course, myths have built up around that particular part of the river because of its particularly dangerous reputation.
Excellent. Other things we want to talk about: the Rhine River Gorge, UNESCO World Heritage Site.
We stopped in Koblenz.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we docked for the night. And then we take a tour, at least Scenic does. I don't know if the other cruise lines do, but we go to Marksburg Castle, which is very near Koblenz. It's one of those hilltop castles.
Yeah.
And we went up there. We take a tour of the castle. And then in the evening, we have a medieval joust meal where they raise mead and whatever. You know, it's all in good fun, basically. But that's also part of the package. And that castle it's called Marksburg. It's a really, really beautiful place. And the thing I liked about it the most is that they haven't really gone in and tried to redo it to make it more authentic looking. So in the end, it looks fake somehow. It really feels like they didn't touch this castle. So they show you where the latrine was, which is like right off the kitchen. I mean, it's like it was 800 years ago or 600 years ago or something like that. Very, very interesting place. And you do really learn a lot about living in those castles. And one thing that you really learn is that even though those people who lived in those castles were the wealthiest of the wealthy at the time, they still had a very miserable and lonely life living in those castles.
I did not do that tour. I've got pictures of passing that castle, but have not been inside. Excellent.
From Koblenz, it's a pretty short hop up to Amsterdam. Mm-hmm. It's a long hop when you look at it on a map, but the Rhine moves pretty quick and it's a big river. The boat can make pretty good time. So between there and Amsterdam, we only stop in one other place, and that's Cologne. Mm-hmm. In Cologne, of course, our guests have a couple of excursions. They can take a walking tour of the city that includes a tour of the Cologne Cathedral. Mm-hmm. That enormous Gothic church survived World War II bombing when the rest of the city did not. And then a couple of other excursions in Cologne. It's a very modern German city. It's also a very pleasant German city. It seems like people live pretty well there. But one thing we did in Cologne that I would recommend to anyone, even if not on a cruise or something, but to make a little side trip over to Dusseldorf. It's not very far. It only takes half an hour, 45 minutes or something. We took a tour of the Neanderthal Museum there, and that's where the Neanderthal is, right, in Dusseldorf. The word Tal means valley. Mm-hmm. So you say the Neanderthal Valley, it's a little bit of a oxymoron, I guess. Neanderthal, or the Neanderthal man, that was actually a valley that was very close to Dusseldorf. And you can go through the valley where they found the skeletal remains of the Neanderthal man and led to changing a lot of theories about our evolution as a species on the planet. And the museum itself is really well done. It's not just about the Neanderthal or the valley, but all of the scientific discoveries around the world to try to put together our species and its existence. And I think it's really worth a side trip.
Well, and when I was there, I learned that the Neander Valley was named by a local hymn writer, basically one of the Calvinist Reformed church leaders in Dusseldorf, and you can still see his church now. This was a region that was predominantly Catholic, and so his church is kind of hidden away because if you had a Protestant church, they were allowed to be there at this time, but not to be prominent. No big deal about it. But you can visit Neander's church, and then basically he used to go write his hymns up in this valley that got to be known since he was so well known as his valley. And so Neanderthal is named after Joachim Neander.
Yes, you would expect it to be named after an eminent scientist or, somebody who would know, but it's actually not. It's just a kind of talented but relatively ordinary guy, when it comes to finding out the origins of our species.
Exactly. We've done episodes on Dusseldorf. The other thing I would say about Dusseldorf and also about Köln, or Cologne, depending on whether you're using the French or the German word for it, is that if you're there in, say, February-ish, they both have quite large festivals for Carnival. Huge festivals, and that was something that surprised me. I didn't realize, because this portion of Germany was Catholic along the Rhine, that they're stunning festivals. I was in a parade in Dusseldorf, which we talk about in the episode we did, that went on for 2 hours, and like 1 million people, I think, or something like that, showed up in costume too. It's their version of Halloween with the kids all dressed in costume and people throwing things from the floats. So definitely, if you're there at that time of year, both those cities compete really with each other. There's a rivalry between them for how they celebrate that holiday.
When we arrived in Dusseldorf, the tour guide asked us where we were, and we said Cologne, and she said, "Oh, the enemy city." So funny.
Which is ridiculous, because if you're in one, you should go to the other. They're both beautiful cities, but excellent. And then Amsterdam, of course, we have more information about that on the show. You mentioned the Anne Frank house there and needing ahead of time. Is there one other spot in Amsterdam that people should see that they don't know about, besides the famous art galleries there and the Anne Frank house? I think are the two best known places to see.
For me, that's a really busy day. I don't actually get to see a lot of outside the general stuff, because Scenic and National Geographic in Amsterdam, because it's so difficult to actually run a guided tour in Amsterdam. It's so crowded that instead what they do is to give the guests, 2 or 3 hours or even longer, 5 hours or something, of what they call free time.
Okay.
Look, here's the map. Here's,
you're not going to be able to keep up with
here's our information. Here's where the boat is. Don't get lost. Have fun. For me, as the destination expert, people ask me, well, where are you going to go for the next few hours? And I'm like, well, I'm just going to take a walk through the town. If you're welcome to walk with me if you'd like, or go off on your own. And understandably, a good percentage of the boat actually comes with me. So I end up leading a kind of impromptu tour through Amsterdam. We walked along the canals. We go through, of course, the red light district. If people had been to Amsterdam when they were kids, like after in their university years or shortly after, they might remember the red light district, not for the red lights and not even necessarily for the coffee houses, but for the fact that was where all the cheap youth hostels used to be. So to me, that neighborhood feels very familiar. So I always like to go back through there and take some of my guests through there and talk about those old days. And then we walk the typical stuff. We walk right up the main street from the train station, taking some of the canals, like I said, and then maybe go up towards the flower market or towards the cheese market, which are pretty close together, actually, and then come back to the boat. And that really, when you're taking an impromptu tour of 20 or 25 people, that can take the whole day, basically, just to make that circuit.
Interesting.
Which is a great little walk.
Yeah.
Like what we said when we started the conversation in Budapest, it takes some time maybe to hang out in Amsterdam longer than the cruise, because there's just so much more to see. And our cruise really only skims the surface of what that city has to offer. We did offer one specialized excursion to the Rijksmuseum. That was a National Geographic exclusive. but any passenger could come along. And that included a tour of the museum. And we caught the very tail end, although we didn't see all the Rembrandts, but we caught the tail end of the Rembrandt death. The anniversary of Rembrandt's death was this year at 350 years.
Ah, okay.
And our tour guide was fantastic. She found, I don't know, maybe 20 paintings in that enormous museum and took us to each one and told us a story about it. So gave us a nice little overview. So I thought that was highly worthwhile.
Well, and if you're a fan of the Dutch Masters, I mean, that is a stunning museum, not just because the paintings are good, but some of them are also huge. These stunning paintings where you walk in and the wall is one of the Dutch master paintings and such.
Oh, absolutely.
And you mentioned Amsterdam being crowded, and it certainly is. It's definitely one of those cities that I would rank as being over-touristed, probably. If you're looking for an alternative in the area that's a little quieter, I would go up to Edam. Small town, beautiful things. I mean, it gets a fair number of tourists too, but home of Edam cheese. Or go over to Haarlem. So if you can't get tickets for Anne Frank House, go to Corrie ten Boom's house over in Haarlem, which is another similar story, except that Corrie ten Boom was the Dutch person who was hiding the Jewish people in her house. She and her family went off to the concentration camps, as she documents in the book, The Hiding Place, and she survived, unlike Anne Frank. So that's another similar story. And Haarlem is a very sleepy town, so that would be an alternative there. Excellent. So I think we've covered our itinerary here. Are we ready for some wrap-up questions here before we start to go into our second or third hour?
We did 15 days, Chris. Not bad.
Excellent.
Not bad.
If I pegged you to come up with the prettiest spot here on these three rivers and a canal or two, you're standing in front of the prettiest spot. Where are you standing and what are you looking at?
It's early morning. We're going through Slovakia and we're turned around and we're looking at Devon Castle, which is in Slovakia. It's a ruin. I think the castle dates from 800 or 900 AD, but before that was maybe a Celtic fortress or some kind of place. But it's a very forlorn ruin. It's a national history spot for Slovaks. And the way that our cruise is structured, you go through there 7 a.m. Not too many people are up at that hour. You're standing there with your coffee and you look up. The Danube is beautiful at that spot. And it's, wow, I'm on a river cruise. It's great.
Excellent. One thing that makes you laugh about river cruising.
One of the things that makes me laugh about river cruising is the importance of the coffee machine on board. Because when you wake up in the morning, like I said, you want to go up on the sun deck, it's very important to get that cup of coffee. And we had a really quirky coffee machine on our boat. And there was always that moment of suspense when you push the button, whether you're really going to get a cup of coffee at that moment or not. So we would make some jokes about that occasionally. Another thing is that in scenic cruises, they always put a can of Pringles for some reason in your cabin. So I don't know what you're supposed to do with those Pringles, but collect them and trade them for prizes or something. Anyway, just little stuff like that. I think the best thing about the cruises and the things that do make you laugh are the fact that you do meet people in 15 days. You become quite close to people on board your boat. You actually make friendships. You have so much shared experience and you start laughing about everything. You start laughing about the cruise director. You start laughing about the boat, about the guys who serve you the food, or about each other. It's not malicious laughter in any way. It's good fun. You're back in school all of a sudden with your friends.
One thing we didn't talk about that is quirky with river cruising that they do on most river cruises I've been on is the quiet boxes or the quiet boxes, where as you do your guided tours, you often are given a receiver and earplugs so that you can wander away from the guide and the guide doesn't have to be yelling at you and you can hear their talking. And that's something that is pretty common on river cruises. I'm assuming Scenic has that as well.
Yes. Well, what they've done, though, is they used to have what they called their tailor-made device, which was actually a separate audio guide. What they've done now is they've gotten rid of that and put all that information on an app on your telephone.
Oh, interesting.
If you don't have an iPhone or equivalent, a relatively modern one, you ought to think about investing in one before you take a river cruise because you're probably going to need it just to hear the guides talk.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense rather than having the tailor-made device. Well, and the other thing I always liked about that, to be honest, was I don't like to pretend that I'm with that large group of people, and so I'm at the other end of the square taking pictures. I'm not with them, and I would take out their headphones and put in my white earbuds, and you couldn't tell that I was with that group. It's just me, possibly, but you can get a fair ways away, and then, of course, you have to keep an eye out for when they turn around a corner and you start losing them because they have walked away from you.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Our guest again has been Mark Baker, a travel writer, guidebook author. Mark, do you have any posts on your own blog about river cruising that we should direct people to as a good example of what to learn?
For the listeners I've written several times in the last several months about river cruises, what to expect, what cabins look like, just what you do, and some interesting things. Anyway, it's all on my blog, and my blog's URL is www.markbakerprog.com. So markbakerprog.com.
Excellent. Well, Mark, thanks so much for coming back on the show. I'd also encourage people to go back and listen to that show about the Volga also with Mark. And Mark has also been on This Week in Travel as well. And thanks for sharing with us your love for the river cruise and for the Danube.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you.
In news of the community, I had a correction from Mark, who was listening to the episode we did on Southwest Colorado, and he said, as a Colorado native, I just wanted to update the pronunciation of, and then I'm going to spell it, Ouray. It's Ouray, not Ouray, and yes, it's a bucket list mining town. Southwest Colorado has the most dramatic scenery of the state, in my opinion. It isn't swamped with the tourists and money that Central Colorado, Vail, Aspen, etc., though Telluride obviously could be lumped with those. Thanks so much, Mark. And then I got some feedback from Nathan that made me laugh. He said, among other things, I enjoy listening to your podcast more than any other traveling podcast since you bring such a great personality with your voice. I'm in the habit of saying excellent over a dozen times each day since you reply to your guests excellent when they share their place to visit. When the appropriate time comes in a discussion with my peers about travel, I recommend your show and have them listen to it, and I got my wife to join in listening with me while I drive in the car. I even enjoy listening to your show while getting a workout in. Keep up the great work you're doing, Nathan. And I had to laugh because I'm just so aware that I say excellent a lot, and I've certainly been critiqued for it fairly, but we've done a lot of shows, and it's just a habit that is ingrained, and I honestly don't think I'm going to be able to stop it. So I appreciate that, Nathan, you have leaned into it. With that, we're going to end this episode of Amateur Traveler. If you have any questions, send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com, or join the mailing list, also at the same website. And thanks so much for listening.